We want you to have facts, not fear. There is a new eviction moratorium. Landlords can't evict tenants until December 31st, but that doesn't mean tenants can get by without paying the bills. And this eviction moratorium is different than the last one. So Issac Sturgill with Legal Aid of North Carolina is here to answer your questions for about the next 15 minutes or so. We want to give you time to text your question. Again, this is a text question only, 336-379-5775. You text the question, we'll get it to them, and we'll get your question answered. All right, first let's just give a quick overview. This new eviction moratorium that went into effect this month, it does give protections to tenants, but tenants have to do something to get their protection.
That's right. So this eviction moratorium, it took effect last Friday, September the 4th, and it lasts all the way through the end of the year. And it's designed to protect tenants who are behind on the rent from being evicted for non-payment of rent. But you're absolutely right. One thing that's very unique about this moratorium is that the tenant has to take some affirmative steps to get the protection under this order. So what the tenant has to do is sign a declaration, which is like an affidavit, and then they have to give that declaration to the landlord in order for the moratorium to take effect for that person.
All right, let's. I think we have some video of the declaration form. This is a form that you would just download from the CDC website. We have it on our website for you. And so it is basically a 2-page form, and it gives you a few things that you have to say are true, and then you need to sign it.
That's correct. So the tenant has to read the declaration and has to make sure that everything in the declaration is true for himself or herself before signing it. And so some of the things that the tenant has to verify are true are things like this. It'll say, yes, I make under a certain amount of money per year, which is $99,000 a year, that they are behind on the rent and unable to pay the rent due to a loss in income. It has to say that if they are evicted, that they'll become homeless. And there's some other qualifications on there too. So the tenant's not supposed to sign the declaration unless all of the statements on there are true. But once the tenant signs the declaration and gives it to their landlord, that's what triggers the protections for that tenant.
Okay, and they just download it, but they don't have to go to the courthouse to sign it or anything like that. They can just sign it and give it to their landlord?
That's correct. That's what the order from the CDC says. There's no requirement that the tenant has to file it in order to get the protections. They just have to read it. They have to sign it and swear that everything on there is true, and then deliver a copy to the landlord. At that point, the landlord is supposed to stop and not take any action to evict the tenant.
Okay, so we do have a text question that says, if the landlord files eviction papers and then the tenant gets these papers to stop the eviction, what happens?
The way that the order reads is that the landlord is not allowed to take any action to cause the tenant to be removed from the property. And so the way that that's been interpreted around most of the country is that that should stop the eviction at any point in the process. So even if the landlord has already filed eviction court papers against the tenant, if the tenant is still living in the home and has not actually physically been evicted from the home yet, once the tenant signs this declaration and gives it to the landlord, that should stop the process in its tracks. Now, if the landlord knows that the tenant has signed this declaration to stop the eviction process and the landlord decides to proceed with the eviction process anyway, there could be some penalties for that. So under the order, there are penalties for the tenant if the tenant violates the order by lying on the declaration, but there's also penalties for the landlord. So if the landlord knows that the tenant has triggered this protection for themselves under the order and the landlord decides to violate the order and proceed with the eviction anyway, there are actually criminal and civil penalties that could go against the landlord in that situation.
Okay, so this is a follow-up text question. This person says, can the landlord reject the moratorium? If he does, what do I do? So what do they physically do?
The landlord, there's nothing in the moratorium that allows the landlord to reject it. However, the moratorium does not apply to every type of eviction. And what I mean by that is the order says that there's certain types of evictions that can proceed as normal and that the tenant is not protected from. And they're listed out in the order, but they include things like evictions for criminal activity, evictions for property damage. So if the tenant damages the property and the landlord wants to evict them for that, that is not covered under the moratorium. Also, if the tenant's violating building or health or safety codes, that could proceed. If the tenant's threatening, violence or harm to the landlord or to other residents, that could still proceed. And also, evictions for lease violations other than non-payment of rent are not covered under this order. So although there's not a way for a landlord to opt out of the protections once the tenant triggers them, there are certain types of evictions that are still allowed to go forward under the order.
Okay, so only this moratorium only covers those who are wanting to not be evicted because due to rent. It's not, can't be for anything else, the non-payment of rent. All right, we've got a couple follow-up texts about like, okay, but what do I do if I need help because my landlord's saying I'm not going to adhere to this paper? We're going to talk about that when we come back in the next segment. You can continue to text your questions 336-379-5775.